For decades, university campuses have been home to student protests. And with pro-Palestinian encampments popping up across the country, there's a renewed interest in freedom of expression and how it's protected on university campuses. Are university campuses private or public? And protesting on university grounds, well, is that illegal?
Students are speaking up now, and they are demanding to stop the violence.
It's illegal to have encampments on a private land, and McGill said that they don't want that it continues.
Ça sert une forme d'activisme politique dans laquelle les Québécois ne se reconnaissent pas.
In this case, it's private property, and the university made it very clear that you can't trespass and you can't camp. So I think people should follow the law.
Some politicians say it's illegal, but I've asked law professors. It's very complex.
Legally very complex issue.
Let me walk you through why. Most major universities in Canada are public institutions, meaning they get a big chunk of money from the government. But universities are separate and independent from the government. They control their own finances, they have internal governance structures, they control admissions, so on and so forth. Most even have their own policies on how to deal with campus protests. But here's the catch. Education is their main role, right? And in Canada, education is generally considered a governmental responsibility. The question here is whether all that means that the freedom of expression should be protected under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms on campus, as it would be in other public lands, say in front of the National Assembly or Parliament Hill.
Let's talk about the encampments that have been popping up. Some politicians, Danielle Smith comes to mind. Legault has also implied something similar, that universities are private property and therefore these protesters are trespassing. How much stock do you give to that assessment?
The really critical question is, what kind of rights do students have to engage in protest on campus? That's really the question. And there's a really open question about whether or not the charter is in fact applicable to protest or different forms of speech on university campuses across the country or in particular provinces.
In some provinces, there's a clear answer.
In Alberta, the Alberta Court of Appeal has found that the Canadian Charter applies to university campuses in the context of regulating student speech, including regulating the space on campus for the purpose of student speech. This is not going to be treated as it's, any random private property. It's treated quite differently because the charter applies, because freedom of expression applies on campus as a constitutional matter.
But in other parts of the country, much muddier.
Different courts have reached a different conclusion. So in Ontario, Saskatchewan, British Columbia, that the charter is not applicable to issues of speech on campus by students. At some point, this issue may get decided by the Supreme Court of Canada.
And even if campus protests are covered under the charter, that ultimately didn't stop the police from coming and dismantling the protest camps at the University of Calgary or the University of Alberta. And that shows how these encampments bring up other questions too.
Even outside of the constitutional and legal questions, there is this conflict within the university's own values, especially when they're cracking down so hard and so quickly on peaceful encampments.
There's also the fact that several encampments, like this one at McGill, have received support from some Indigenous groups who say it's pretty hypocritical for the university to claim the land as private while also giving land acknowledgements.
This is not McGill's land in the first place, and they know it too. Everybody knows that.
There's also questions here about what are the factors that would make it legitimate for authorities to come and shut down, dismantle protest encampments like what we're seeing. In other words, what are the limits of freedom of expression, even if it's covered under the charter?
Protests are always disruptive to some extent. The difficult question is, well, how much disruption is too much? How extreme must it be? How long must it go before we say this disruption is no longer acceptable? And reasonable people can disagree about that. The challenge really is there is no simple answer to that.